High above the scarred landscape of the Somme River Valley on a crisp April morning in 1918, a distinct red triplane hunted for prey in the cloud-strewn sky. The pilot was Baron Manfred von Richthofen, the most feared airman of the First World War, who was known to the world as the Red Baron. He scanned the horizon with the sharp eyes of a hunter, looking for the telltale silhouette of a British Sopwith camel. The engine of his Fokker Doctor I roared with a deafening clatter that vibrated through his entire frame. This was not merely a patrol, but a calculated, deadly game of cat and mouse where a single mistake meant death. The stakes in the skies above the Western Front had never been higher than they were in the final year of the Great War. Control of the air meant control of the battle below, as reconnaissance aircraft directed artillery fire with devastating precision upon the trenches. If the German Empire could maintain air superiority, they might blind the Allied forces and break the stalemate that had consumed millions of lives. Every pilot knew that they were fighting not just for personal glory, but for the survival of their nations. The outcome of the entire war hinged upon these fragile machines of wood and canvas. Manfred von Richthofen was the embodiment of this new breed of warrior that the world had never seen before this conflict began. He was a Prussian aristocrat who had traded the safety of the cavalry for the perilous uncertainty of the air service. With 80 confirmed aerial victories, he was a national hero in Germany and a figure of dark fascination for his enemies. His red-painted fighter plane was a psychological weapon that struck terror into the hearts of novice Allied pilots. Yet even a legend like the Red Baron was mortal, and the laws of physics applied to him just as they did to everyone else. How did a war that began with horses and bayonets evolve so rapidly to include complex aerial battles fought thousands of feet above the ground? The transformation of aviation from a novelty into a decisive military instrument is one of the most remarkable stories of the 20th century. It raises the question of how young men with little training mastered these temperamental machines while being shot at by enemies. The history of aerial combat is a tale of rapid technological innovation driven by the desperate need to survive. We must understand the origins of this deadly dance to appreciate the sacrifice of those who fought. The answer lies in the brutal necessity of total war, where every advantage was seized and exploited regardless of the cost in human life. The rise of the fighter ace was not an accident, but the result of a systematic evolution in tactics and technology. From the early days of waving at enemy pilots to the ruthless efficiency of the flying circuses, the air war changed the face of combat forever. The legacy of these pioneers is written in the skies they conquered and the graves they filled. This narrative reveals the courage and the tragedy behind the romantic myth of the dogfight. When the First World War began in August of 1914, the concept of air-to-air combat was virtually non-existent among the major powers. Pilots flew simple unarmed monoplanes and biplanes primarily for reconnaissance missions to observe enemy troop movements. These early aviators considered themselves a fraternity of gentlemen who rose above the squalor of the trench warfare below. It was not uncommon for opposing pilots to wave at one another as they passed in the sky on their way to gather intelligence. The idea of mounting a machine gun on such a fragile craft seemed absurd and technically impossible to many engineers. However, the gentlemanly conduct of the early weeks quickly evaporated as the strategic importance of aerial reconnaissance became undeniably clear to the generals. Pilots began taking pistols and rifles into their cockpits to take potshots at enemy aircraft that they encountered on patrol. Some airmen even carried bricks or metal darts to drop onto the propellers of opposing planes in a crude attempt to bring them down. The frustration of seeing an enemy observer fly away unharmed drove pilots to demand better weapons. The sky was rapidly becoming a battlefield where chivalry would soon be replaced by cold and calculated aggression. The primary technical hurdle preventing effective air combat was the spinning propeller at the front of the most efficient tractor aircraft designs. Mounting a machine gun on the fuselage allowed for easier aiming, but firing it would inevitably shatter the wooden propeller blades. The French pilot Roland Garros attempted a dangerous solution by attaching steel deflector plates to his propeller blades to deflect bullets. While this method was crude and risked damaging the engine, it allowed Garros to shoot directly forward. He achieved immediate success and terrorized German pilots who could not understand how he was firing through his propeller. The German response to the success of Roland Garros came from the brilliant Dutch aircraft designer Anthony Fokker, who was working for the German Empire. Fokker and his team examined the captured plane of Garros and realized that deflector plates were too dangerous for widespread use. Instead, they developed a revolutionary mechanism known as the synchronization gear, or the interrupter gear. This mechanical linkage connected the engine to the machine gun and ensured that the weapon only fired when the propeller blade was out of the line of fire. It was a masterpiece of engineering that turned the airplane into a true weapon of war. The introduction of the Fokker Eindecker equipped with the synchronization gear in 1915 launched a period known as the Fokker Scourge. German pilots could now aim their entire aircraft at the enemy and unleash a stream of bullets without fear of destroying their own propeller. Allied aircraft, which were mostly pusher types with rear-mounted engines, were suddenly outclassed and defenseless against this new threat. The Eindecker was not a particularly superior airplane in terms of flight performance, but its armament made it the deadliest machine in the sky. Allied losses mounted rapidly as the Germans established total dominance. Two German pilots rose to prominence during this period and laid the foundation for all future fighter tactics. Oswald Bolk and Max Immelmann were the first true aces who utilized the Fokker Eindecker to devastating effect. Max Immelmann became famous for a maneuver that bears his name, the Immelmann turn, which allowed a pilot to gain altitude and reverse direction simultaneously. This maneuver enabled him to attack an enemy and then quickly reposition for a second pass. These early aces demonstrated that flying skill and tactical positioning were just as important as the quality of the aircraft. Oswald Bolk was a visionary leader who understood that the era of the lone wolf hunter was coming to an end. He codified the rules of air combat into a set of principles known as the Dicta Bolk, which are still taught to fighter pilots today. His rules emphasized the importance of attacking from the sun to blind the enemy and always maintaining a height advantage. Bolk stressed that pilots should never retreat from an attack once it had commenced. He taught his students to fire only at close range when the enemy aircraft filled the gun sight to ensure a kill. Bolk also revolutionized the organization of the German air service by grouping fighter planes into specialized units called Jagdstaffeln or Jastas. Before this reorganization, fighter pilots were often dispersed among reconnaissance units and operated independently. The Jasta system concentrated the best pilots and the best machines into elite squadrons dedicated solely to hunting enemy aircraft. This allowed for coordinated attacks and the development of team tactics that made the German Air Force formidable. The formation flying introduced by Bolk multiplied the effectiveness of the individual pilot and created a lethal fighting force. The Allies were desperate to counter the Fokker Scourge and began developing their own fighters to challenge the German dominance. The British introduced the Airco DH-2 and the Royal Aircraft Factory, FE-2, which were pusher aircraft with the propeller behind the pilot. While these designs were aerodynamic nightmares compared to the sleek German tractors, they allowed for a forward-firing machine gun. The French introduced the nimble Nieuport 11, which was a small biplane that could outmaneuver the heavier Fokker Eindecker. These new Allied aircraft slowly began to turn the tide of the air war by early 1916. As the Battle of the Somme raged on the ground in 1916, the air war intensified with hundreds of aircraft clashing over the front lines. The British Royal Flying Corps adopted an aggressive strategy of constant offensive patrols deep behind German lines. This doctrine aimed to seize control of the airspace, but it resulted in heavy casualties for British pilots. The Germans adopted a defensive posture and waited for the British to come to them, which gave them a tactical advantage. The skies above the Somme became a graveyard for young aviators who were often shot down on their first mission. The spring of 1917 marked the lowest point for the Royal Flying Corps in a period that history remembers as Bloody April. The Germans had introduced superior new fighters like the Albatros D3, which featured a streamlined fuselage and twin machine guns. The British were still flying obsolete aircraft that were no match for the German Hunters. During this single month, the British lost over 1/3 of their active combat pilots. The life expectancy of a new British pilot arriving at the front was measured in weeks or sometimes even days. It was during this period of intense aerial warfare that Manfred von Richthofen ascended to the status of a living legend. He took command of Jaster 11 and turned it into the most effective killing unit in the German air service. Richthofen decided to paint his Albatros fighter bright red to provoke his enemies and to ensure his men could identify him in the chaos of battle. This act of bravado violated the principles of camouflage, but it served a powerful psychological purpose. The sight of the red plane caused panic among Allied formations and attracted the boldest challengers. Manfred von Richthofen eventually commanded a larger formation known as Jagdschwader 1, which the Allies dubbed the Flying Circus. This unit was a mobile strike force that could be moved rapidly by train to any sector of the front where air superiority was needed. The pilots of the Flying Circus painted their aircraft in gaudy colors to identify themselves to one another. The result was a kaleidoscopic display of bright yellows, greens, and blues that looked like a carnival in the sky. But there was nothing festive about their purpose, as they decimated Allied squadrons with ruthless efficiency. While the Germans had the Red Baron, the French had their own ace of aces in the frail but ferocious Georges Guynemer. Guynemer was a sickly young man who had been rejected by the military multiple times before being accepted as a mechanic. He eventually became a pilot and flew with a reckless abandon that bordered on suicidal. He believed in getting as close as possible to the enemy before firing, and often returned to base with his plane riddled with bullets. Guynemer became a symbol of French resistance, and his disappearance in combat in 1917 plunged the nation into mourning. Another French ace named René Fonck took a completely different approach to air combat than the emotional Guynemer. Fonck was a cold and calculating marksman who treated aerial warfare as a scientific problem to be solved with precision. He was known for his incredible conservation of ammunition, often using only a few bullets to down an enemy plane. Fonck never suffered a single bullet hole in his own aircraft despite shooting down 75 enemy planes. He was the highest-scoring Allied ace of the war, but his aloof personality meant he was less loved by the public than Guynemer. The British produced their own roster of heroes, including the intense and solitary Albert Ball, who preferred to hunt alone. Ball was known for stalking German aircraft from below and firing his machine gun upward into their undefended bellies. He was a fearless pilot who often engaged multiple enemy aircraft simultaneously without hesitation. His aggressive spirit inspired the Royal Flying Corps during its darkest days. Like many of the early aces, Ball lived a short life and was killed in a crash after flying into a dense cloud bank during a battle. Later in the war, Edward McManus emerged as the greatest British patrol leader and a fierce hater of the enemy. Mannock was an unlikely ace because he was older than most pilots and suffered from vision problems in one eye. Despite this disability, he developed a keen situational awareness and taught his pilots the value of teamwork. He was a brilliant tactician who believed that the purpose of the fighter pilot was to kill the enemy with maximum efficiency. Mannock is officially credited with 61 victories, but many believe his true score was much higher. The technological arms race continued to accelerate as both sides introduced faster and more powerful aircraft to gain an edge. The British deployed the Royal Aircraft Factory, SE-5A, which was a stable and fast gun platform powered by a V8 engine. It was the favorite mount of many top aces, including Mick Mannock and James McCudden. The SE-5A could dive away from trouble at high speeds and withstand significant battle damage. It provided the Royal Flying Corps with a machine that could finally match the performance of the best German Albatros fighters. The most famous British fighter of the war was undoubtedly the Sopwith Camel, which is credited with shooting down more enemy aircraft than any other type. The Camel was a small biplane with a rotary engine and twin synchronized machine guns mounted in a hump ahead of the cockpit. It was incredibly agile and could turn to the right faster than any other plane due to the torque of its engine. However, it was also notoriously difficult to fly and killed many student pilots in training accidents. In the hands of an expert, it was a deadly weapon. The Germans countered the Allied advances with the Fokker Dr. I triplane, which became iconic as the mount of the Red Baron. The three wings of the Dr. I provided immense lift and allowed the plane to climb rapidly and turn inside almost any opponent. It was slower than many Allied fighters, but its maneuverability in a dogfight was unmatched. The triplane required a skilled pilot to handle its quirks, and it suffered from structural issues that caused wing failures. Despite these flaws, it remains the most recognizable shape of First World War aviation. The entry of the United States into the war in 1917 brought a fresh influx of manpower and resources to the Allied cause. Before the official declaration of war, many American volunteers had already been flying for France in the Lafayette Escadrille. These Americans were driven by a sense of adventure and a desire to help the French Republic in its time of need. They faced the same dangers as their French counterparts and established a reputation for bravery. Their mascot was a lion cub named Whiskey who lived at the aerodrome. The most famous alumnus of the Lafayette Escadrille was Raoul Lufbery, who became a mentor to the new generation of American pilots. Lufbery was a seasoned adventurer who had traveled the world before the war and possessed a calm demeanor in combat. He taught the green American pilots the survival skills they needed to face the veteran German Jastas. Lufbery developed a defensive circle formation known as the Lufbery Circle, which allowed pilots to protect each other's tails. His death in 1918 was a severe blow to the morale of the American Air Service. The leading American ace of the war was Eddie Rickenbacker, who had been a famous race car driver before he joined the Army. Rickenbacker applied his knowledge of engines and mechanics to his aircraft and was meticulous about gun maintenance. He flew with the 94th Aero Squadron and quickly proved himself to be a natural leader and a gifted tactician. Rickenbacker overcame the initial skepticism of his peers to become the commander of the squadron. He finished the war with 26 confirmed victories and the Medal of Honor. The 94th Aero Squadron adopted the insignia of a hat in the ring, symbolizing that Uncle Sam had thrown his hat into the ring of the war. This unit became the most famous American fighter squadron and attracted aggressive pilots who wanted to make a name for themselves. They flew French-built Nieuport and Spad fighters, since the United States had not yet developed its own combat aircraft. The pilots of the 94th faced the best of the German Air Force in the final months of the war. Their exploits were followed avidly by the American public back home. While Rickenbacker was a disciplined leader, another American pilot, named Frank Luke Jr., earned a reputation as a reckless lone wolf. Luke was known as the Arizona Balloon Buster for his specialty of attacking heavily defended German observation balloons. These balloons were critical targets, but they were protected by rings of anti-aircraft guns and machine guns. Attacking a balloon was considered one of the most dangerous missions a pilot could undertake. Luke attacked them with a ferocity that bordered on madness, often ignoring orders and flying at dusk. Observation balloons were filled with highly flammable hydrogen gas and would explode in a massive fireball when hit with incendiary bullets. The Germans knew the value of these balloons and surrounded them with flak batteries that filled the sky with shrapnel. A pilot had to dive through a wall of exploding steel to get within range of the balloon. Even if the pilot succeeded in igniting the gas, the explosion itself could engulf his aircraft. Frank Luke destroyed 14 balloons and 4 planes in just 17 days before he was killed. As the war entered its final phase, the role of the fighter aircraft expanded beyond air-to-air combat to include ground attack missions. Pilots began strafing enemy trenches and supply columns with machine gun fire and small bombs. This was incredibly dangerous work, as the aircraft were vulnerable to ground fire from thousands of rifles and machine guns. The psychological effect on the troops on the ground was terrifying, as they had nowhere to hide. This evolution marked the beginning of close air support, which would dominate future wars. The death of Manfred von Richthofen on April 21, 1918, marked the end of an era and a turning point in the air war. He was pursuing a novice Canadian pilot named Wilfred May at low altitude when he was struck by a single bullet. The fatal shot likely came from Australian ground troops firing machine guns, or possibly from Canadian Captain Arthur Roy Brown. The Red Baron managed to land his plane, but was dead before help arrived. His death proved that the German Air Force was losing its grip on the skies. The British buried Manfred von Richthofen with full military honors in a ceremony that demonstrated the lingering chivalry of the air war. Allied officers served as pallbearers, and a wreath was inscribed with the words "To our gallant and worthy foe." Photographs of the funeral were dropped over German lines to inform them of his fate. The loss of their greatest hero was a devastating blow to German morale. It signaled that the tide had irrevocably turned against the Central Powers. Following the death of Richthofen, the command of his famous wing eventually fell to a future infamous figure named Hermann Göring. Göring was a competent ace with 22 victories, but he lacked the charisma and leadership style of the Red Baron. Under his command, the unit continued to fight bravely, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of Allied aircraft. The blockade of Germany meant that fuel and materials were in short supply. The German pilots were fighting a losing battle of attrition. By late 1918, the air war had evolved into massive furballs, involving dozens of aircraft swirling in a chaotic melee. The days of individual duels were largely replaced by squadron-sized engagements that filled the sky. The Allies now possessed superior numbers and aircraft that were equal to or better than the German machines. The Fokker D-7 was an excellent late-war German fighter, but there were simply not enough of them. The Allied industrial machine was churning out planes faster than the Germans could shoot them down. The armistice on November 11, 1918 brought a sudden silence to the battlefields and the skies above Europe. The surviving pilots were left to process the trauma of seeing so many of their friends die in burning wrecks. The terms of the peace treaty required Germany to surrender all of its aircraft to the Allies. In a final act of defiance, many German pilots crashed their planes or dismantled them rather than hand them over. The once mighty German air service ceased to exist. The legacy of the World War I aces is a complex mix of romantic myth and brutal reality. The public viewed them as modern knights of the air who fought clean battles above the mud of the trenches. This image was cultivated by propaganda on both sides to maintain morale on the home front. The reality was that these men burned to death, fell without parachutes, and suffered terrible injuries. Yet their courage and skill cannot be denied. The technological progress achieved during these 4 years of war was staggering and unprecedented in history. Aviation had advanced from frail observation platforms to high-performance fighting machines capable of speeds over 130 miles per hour. The tactics developed by Bolk and Manick laid the groundwork for every air force in the world. The fighter plane had established itself as an essential component of military power. The sky was no longer a sanctuary, but a new front line. In the end, the story of the dogfights of the First World War is a human story of young men facing impossible odds. They flew in open cockpits exposed to the freezing cold and the roar of the wind. They fought without radios, relying on hand signals and intuition to survive. The solitary nature of the fighter pilot was born in these clouds. We remember them not just for their victories, but for their pioneering spirit in the dawn of aerial warfare.